Hello. Good afternoon from The Hague, but also good morning and good evening to everyone who is joining from other time zones. Welcome to this panel 6 of the conference, of the third annual conference, Moving Forward, Fragmentation, Polarization and Hybridity in Cyberspace. This is the 6th and the last panel discussion we are going to have during this conference. And this panel is titled Towards Inclusion, the Global Governance of Cyber Norms. And we have 4 excellent papers which are going to be presented by a bit more than 4 excellent speakers. We have a colleague of mine, Fabio Cristiano, who is a postdoctoral researcher here at the Program of Cyber Norms at the University of Leiden, who is going to talk about adversarial cyberspace and agonistic cyber norms. We have Louise Marie Hurel and André Barrinha, who are going to present on hybrid place and the role of civil society in the open-ended working group. We have Irene Poetranto, Josh Gold and Justin Lau from Citizens Lab, University of Toronto, who are going to talk about views of several countries in the open-ended working group and their positions, India, Indonesia and South Africa. And this panel will be wrapped up, the speaking part, with Elmarie Biermann, who is going to zoom in into one of those countries and talk about South African case study and cyber capacity building. And then please do not leave. It is the last panel, but it is not the last part of this event. We will have a keynote by Bruce Schneier after a break, so stay with us till the end of this day. I already talked a bit about this panel, so about you, those of you who are attending, you can submit your Q&A. Please use the Q&A pad. This is at the right bottom of your screen. And please state your name when you're submitting your question. We are not accepting anonymous questions, and mention your affiliation, please. If you have a question for a specific speaker, please mention the name and then state your question. And please, if you can, keep your questions short and sweet. Also, we are trying to engage via social media, so please do spread the word. Please state your opinions, please reply to the presentations, please spread this word all around on Twitter, tweet about the conference using the hashtag CyberNorms2020, and follow us on Twitter at Hague CyberNorms Twitter handle. And without any due delay, I would like to give the floor to Fabio Cristiano, but before you start, Fabio, the rule of the game, each panelist has 10 minutes. I'm going to moderate it mercilessly and unapologetically. And with this, Fabio, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Tanya, and thank you for the nice introduction and for the warnings. I'm happy to be part of this panel presenting this article. It touches upon a lot of issues we've been discussing these days, and of course, this has made my task of writing a presentation about this article even harder, because there is a lot to consider after the discussions of these days, and I'm very happy that we have had these discussions. So the idea with this paper is really about asking what is the relevance of agonistic theory for cyber conflict and cyber norms. And in comparing to what some of the discussions that have occurred this morning, I might say that this article takes much more of a celebration kind of aspect to cyber norms. It celebrates cyber norms, and not so much because they offer solutions, but rather because they actually reveal the importance of politics, and if I may, also the beauty of conflict more in general. So the question really is, what is the relevance of agonistic theory for cyber conflict and cyber norms? And I hope that this is a bit of a more conceptual discussion, but that it can be helpful also for the panelists following, with more kind of empirical kind of discussions and case-related discussions. So the general aim of this paper is a normative one. So it's really about discussing how we should envision the adversarial cyberspace, and in fact it's a critique of this very concept. It contributes to some of the discussions we have had also in these days on the taxonomy of cyber conflicts, how we can see cyber conflict in light of the agonistic perspective. And the part which is going to be the focus of today and the one that is most relevant for this panel is the importance of an agonistic perspective for international cooperation on cyber norms. And of course, this is limited to the UN process. So in a nutshell, the agonistic theory perspective, of course, refers to a very broad political theory, a broad range of political theories that have in Chantal Mouffe one of the most known and accredited for this theory representative. So one of the, in a nutshell, really, for the sake of the discussion today, the agonistic theory perspective argues that political conflicts cannot be resolved. So they are intrinsically related to all social relations, and there is no way to move past conflict. Again, so in this sense, this refers not to all conflicts, but to those conflicts that can actually be regulated by shared norms, right? So the idea that there will be a competition between adversaries rather than enemies. When it comes to the governance aspect of this, and also the communication aspect of the agonistic theory perspective, is really about thinking about the pitfalls of consensus building. Is there something that intrinsic to consensus building that hinders the possibility of norms? So this is going to be some of the things I will be discussing today. So as I say, that I will be focusing perhaps mainly on the questions of international cooperation, but very quickly I also wanted to share the findings and the contribution of this article with regards to the taxonomy of cyber conflicts. There has been a lot of discussions these days on this topic, and so I thought I would contribute to those as well. So very briefly, political conflicts are there to stay. We should start theorizing and thinking about the violence aspect of cyber conflicts rather than the use of force, right? Because violence in agonistic theory is really what is differentiating constructive conflicts from destructive ones. And then in this light of the agonistic theory, of course, it's important to think about this conflict through the blurring boundaries between information warfare and cyber warfare, and the extent to which these two categories still make sense. And most important, I think, adding to the debate, and most novel, if I may, is that these conflicts are not necessarily events that norms have to address, but they're instead the quality, right, of these interactions in cyberspace. I think it has been argued in the past days that we are moving towards more kind of a permanent engagement, so that it's very difficult to see conflicts as events, but they are rather a quality of the political interactions online. So I will not say much about the history of the UN process. I'm sure you are familiar with that. The two elements which are very important for the case that I analyze in my article of the open-ended working group is actually that these negotiations are, of course, strongly based on consensus. And another element is, of course, which is important when we have an agonistic theory perspective, is pluralism. And in the paper, I see that the ways in which pluralism plays out in the negotiations is basically threefolded. So there is, of course, the institutional dialogue dimension, and particularly in the ways in which the open-ended working group relates to other bodies within the UN universe, but also pluralism intended as the form of multi-stakeholderism, right? This is really a quality that this new group has taken, and something which is not going to be reflected too much in the presentation or more in the article is that there is also a pluralist take on cybersecurity which is emerging, and I'm referring in particular to kind of the consideration related to gender, human rights, sustainable development, and so on and so forth. So really the ways in which cybersecurity becomes something more than security in a traditional sense. So these are the two main ways in which I've conducted my analysis. And it's also important to say that pluralism has been one of the arguments put forward for the very creation of the open-ended working group. So it was very interesting for me to see how actually the pluralism is playing out in this context. An interesting quote that might indicate you the reason for why I'm doing this. During the interviews with one of the state representative, one of the answers from the interviewee was that actually we need to depoliticize the process if we want to succeed. And the argument of this presentation of the article is exactly the opposite, that we should find ways of embracing the adversarial cyberspace and the ways in which conflicts can contribute to the ambition of moving forward with cyber norms. This is the analytical frame that I've been using. I will not go too much into this, but this is going to be in the article. And of course, states, I've analyzed states' submissions and as well views with state representatives, and I've mapped them through these different categories. As you can see, there is different approaches to the negotiation, and the two extreme in this sense you can see are the consensus and the agonism one, whereas antagonism would put the contribution outside of the realm of the deliberation. So, long story short, of course, by positioning the different interviews and submissions on these categories, you see that there is states which belong more to the antagonist kind of take on the negotiation. So today the analysis and the different illustrations will be pretty much related to those states that, with not so much surprise, are actually those very states that have been argued for pluralism when the open-ended working group was eventually launched. So how is the pluralism being articulated by these states in terms of institutional dialogue? And so the first is a very interesting quote from Cuba, which is rejecting all formulations done in the pre-draft of the open-ended working group that are attempting to link the work of the open-ended working group with one of the experts, right? So there is really a rejection of the sort of institutional dialogue, which is in fact part of the mission of the group. And similarly, Russia in its submission kind of leverages on the question of pluralism to argue that making references to the other group is eventually insulting for the members of the open-ended working group. And same, Iran says that the group of experts should become perhaps as a subsidiary of the open-ended working group. So this is really a negative take, an antagonist take on institutional dialogue. Same goes when it comes to multi-stakeholderism. China and Russia similarly say that the importance of multi-stakeholderism is exaggerated, and we should focus on states rather than multi-stakeholders. And again, this goes against the premise of wanting to have a more plural body for discussing these issues, right? And so there are pitfalls with consensus, and I think this is the target of this presentation, is whether we should perhaps envision ways of moving beyond consensus building. Because according to agonistic theories, consensus is really about overlooking the power relations in a way that distorts diplomatic tactics. So if we do not consider the geopolitical dimensions of the debate, we fail to understand the diplomatic tactics and envision the process as disconnected, right, from other political dynamics. Consensus building is often exclusive in terms of because it polarizes, right, positions. So when we read these submissions, a lot of smaller countries are really kind of aligning themselves to the main narratives. And this gives just the illusion, right, of participation to the point in which there are only two main narratives emerging. And as we have been saying these days with presentations, for instance, on India, it's important to think about other ways, other narratives besides the two main ones. So again, this is the pitfall of consensus in light of agonistic theory. So moving forward, some more on the positive side, it's important for the contribution, and I'm concluding, Tanya, of this presentation, is that actually we should move ahead with cyber norms by considering the fact that international cooperation is embedded in geopolitical conflicts, and that's something that cannot be overcome. This means also that we should envision realistic objectives in terms of being successful in the negotiation as we move forward. Think about ways that can advance inclusion beyond multi-stakeholderism, because it seems sometimes that this kind of sense of pluralism is just about counting who is there rather than the quality of the different narratives and the availability for the different narratives and contestation to be there, and more in general to kind of reconsider the role of consensus. Another, of course, important question is whether are we there already in terms of cyber norms, and whether there is already a saturation of cyber norms. There is no way to move past this status. Concluding, the latest news about the new different resolutions seem to signal change or the need of the process to advance, the actors' willingness to move forward. But this really reminded me another quote, which is not from a state representative, but is from Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa, 1958, that says, "For things to remain the same, everything must change." And this is really the impression I got by reading this new stage of the conflict of governance on cyber norms, and the idea that perhaps we should kind of think.
Fabio, we have a conflict here, not on cyber norms, but I believe that you have a second to finish your sentence.
Yeah, I finished.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And let's move from this conceptual discussion to practical implications. From this adversarial cyberspace and agonistic perspective to hybrid places, where these political conflicts are being addressed or not, to consensus building process. And Fabio mentioned pluralism and multi-stakeholderism. And the next paper, the next presentation by André Barrinha, a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of Bath, and Louise Marie Hurel from London School of Economics, where she is a PhD candidate, will speak about hybrid place of the OEWG and civil society in this hybrid place. And Louise and André, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. It's a pleasure to be here. I wish we could be in The Hague, but we have the virtual Hague, so let's go with that for now. So this working paper is very much emerged from following closely the OEWG. I myself have been able to participate in the intersessional meeting and other kind of side meetings. But we have so far in kind of international cybersecurity discussions, especially when it comes to cyber norms, heard a lot from many stakeholders, and especially, for example, the private sector, is the acknowledgement that cybersecurity is some kind of a shared responsibility. However, what comments, discourses, and assumptions such as this fail to provide is an account of what non-state actors do and their practices, and what kind of security are they actually talking about. André, can you go to the next slide, please? So what they're actually talking about when they talk about cybersecurity. So this paper draws from these concerns to ask, how has civil society engaged in international cybersecurity processes? And with that in mind, this paper really explores civil society's engagement and representation within the context of the OEWG. So a UN state-centric first committee process. And it does so by problematizing the idea of civil society as a hybrid construct. So the proposal of the OEWG, as most of you already know, was approved in 2018 at the same time as the UNGG resolution, creating 2 channels for a discussion on cyber norms. So regardless of the merits and motivations behind its creation, in practice, the OEWG actually broadened the space for interstate discussions within the UN, including all of the member states, while also providing the possibility for stakeholders, other stakeholders, to be involved in the process, including civil society. So if you look at the quotes over there, you see that it's about the possibility of including. It does not necessarily enforce that, does not necessarily say that it will do that, but it provides the possibility, and that is something that needs further investigation. And when we saw that the process of the OEWG and the establishment of the intersessional, we just thought, well, maybe this requires further attention as to what kind of participation are we actually talking over there, what kind of inclusion. So in doing so, by doing that, the OEWG has actually revived fundamental questions of participation, representation, and legitimacy of action from civil society groups in shaping and making global cybersecurity. André, can you go to the next slide, please? But obviously what follows is really a question of who is civil society and how civil society has engaged in cybersecurity beyond the OEWG. So to answer the first question, we understand civil society as a hybrid construct, as I said, but hybridity in this case is a heuristic tool that allows us to visualize and position these contested categories of both civil society and the state in a more nuanced understanding of the political dynamics in the field of global cybersecurity. So really in doing so, we not only hope to contribute to a deeper and more complex understanding of civil society in these places, but also of the role it plays and the constraints it faces amidst the contingent struggles within and among states. So there are 3 ways in which we conceptualize hybridity, and hybridity as linked to civil society. So first, we look at it as diverse and unified. We understand the role of civil society as modular, both evoking a complex and cohesive agency that is mobilized as one category, operating as self-explanatory, and as multiple and complex. Second, we also understand civil society as a hybrid construct as both a concept and a category. A concept in the sense that it is contested because there are multiple different civil society groups, different agencies over there, different positionalities and regions that are included over there. And also as a category that is sometimes, for example, mobilized by states as part of their efforts to signify what inclusion means. And finally, the third way in which we see that is that it's not necessarily about talking about what civil society is in this context, but what it actually does. So hybridity resides in unpacking these practices, these strategies, and discourses. So these civil society organizations have engaged in cybersecurity in different forms already. So it's not to say that it doesn't exist, you know. So the Freedom Online Coalition is one example. The Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace is another, and the Paris Call is even another. But they provide different ways of engaging. The FOC, it talks about representation and inclusion in working groups. The Global Commission is about having a commissioner there. And the Paris Call is about this collective group of civil society organizations signing a particular document. But what does this engagement actually mean in the context of the first committee? André?
Thank you, Louise. So when the open-ended working group met for the first time in New York in September 2019, the chair had already proposed to the members that the broad participation that Louise was mentioning just now should include creating an intersessional meeting with multiple stakeholders. In practice, this would mean that the contribution from civil society and other non-state actors to the open-ended working group would take at least 4 different forms. They would be able to attend the substantive sessions, they would be able to provide written input at several stages of the process, they would be able to convene with government representatives outside the meeting rooms, and obviously they would be able to actively participate in the intersessional meeting. The the meeting took place in early December, again in New York City, and it was announced as being informal and consultative. And it counted with the participation of 100 states and 114 organizations. The meeting itself started with a mix of what we could describe as excitement and caution that was visible in the layout of the room. On one side of the room, there were the member states, on the other side, everyone else, or almost, as it has happened in other meetings of this nature, sometimes states sponsor non-state actors to participate from their own seat. And that was the case with the Cybersecurity Experts Association of Nigeria, for example, that participated in a meeting from the Nigerian seat rather than from the stakeholder side of the room. And we find this to be a good example of hybridity. In the initial statement, Ambassador Loba, the chair of the OEWG, made sure to separate the meeting from the OEWG's usual business. And before giving the floor to the chair, David Koh from Singapore, he explained the need for the intersessional to have a separate chair. And then he said, and I quote, "We chose the solution of having a special chair for the intersessionals to clearly also mark that this is part of the whole process, but it's a bit separate. So just to visualize this, I'm going to switch chairs to make it even more clear for everybody." And so we did. And that's the picture at the top that you have on the slide. As written in a subsequent chair summary, the stakeholders expressed the hope that the multi-stakeholderism would not be a ticking of a participation box, but that all stakeholders would have a role in actively shaping policy and decision making. So I think that summarizes quite nicely the expectations of all these stakeholders and what really is at stake here. As Louise said, this is an ongoing project, and the aim is to offer a critical reading of the role of the non-state actors in international cybersecurity discussions, with a particular focus on the OEWG. And although we are obviously fully aware that this is an ongoing process, our focus was on why and how civil society was allowed to participate in the first place. In subsequent research, we hope to be able to focus on the content and quality of that contribution. So the paper focuses on the hybrid understanding of civil society as both a collective actor and as an aggregate of different groups and interests. Civil society, understood from a hybridity perspective, sheds light on who can be in the room, what are the possibilities of action, and who is represented. It destabilizes its meaning as well as of those with whom it interacts. In that regard, the division of the room between states and the rest symbolizes a process of construction of the division between a state-led world and a non-state-led world, where it matters more to have Russia and Vanuatu, with all respect to Vanuatu, on the same side of the room than it does to separate a multinational giant such as Microsoft from a small NGO. And this social construction is ultimately about reinforcing state versus non-state narratives, for which civil society is often what companies, academia, and states are not. It's a concept that fills a gap and enhances the legitimacy of the process, for civil society is about representativeness and plurality, even if it is not. It is about the collective that represents an undefined group that is important to interact and give legitimacy to the process, but which is not sufficiently legitimate to sit at the main table or the same side of the room or to make any meaningful decisions. However, and this is our last point, as shown by the Nigerian delegation, there is a hybridity that comes from inside the state that destabilizes the fixed arrangement that the divided room and the swapping of chairs wanted to portray. In that regard, hybridity not only helps us destabilize the meaning of civil society, but also that of the state, putting into question the artificial construction of barriers between state and the rest, between the more legitimate and the less legitimate. In short, it opens the door for a revaluation of who, how, and what should be deciding the future of international cybersecurity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, André. Thank you very much, Louise. And building upon this excellent conceptual framework presented by Fabio, and building upon your research on the role of civil society and the place of civil society in OEWG, we are moving to the states. And there is no issue about the legitimacy of the state in the OEWG process. There is no issue whether states can be at the table, whether states can speak, but what about states' position? How they drive the consensus? Are they all equal? And with this, we are going to move to the third paper we have here by Irene Poetranto, Justin Lau, and George Gold, as I said, all affiliated with Citizens Lab, and they are going to talk about 3 countries who, according to them, are taking middle ground in this OEWG process. And George, Justin, and Irene, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Josh.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Josh, we can hear you. Josh, you're muted again.
Okay, how's now? Good, and I'm just trying to share my screen, but looks like I have to go to system preferences to do so or something. Justin, are you able to, by any chance, share, or Irene?
I don't have it up. Irene, do you have it up?
I do, yes. So let me try.
Sorry about this.
It's okay.
Yeah, if I approve it, then I have to quit.
Are you able to see?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, okay.
Great. So thanks for having us, and a good morning from Toronto, where Irene and I are, and Ottawa, where Josh is. And Josh and I will be presenting today's presentation, while Irene will join us in answering questions at the end. So in our 10-minute presentation today, we'll focus on India, Indonesia, and South Africa to argue that these 3 middle power, non-aligned countries hold a purposeful middle ground position within global cyber governance discussions, namely those underway at the United Nations. And our presentation will proceed in 4 main parts. First, in part 1, we'll give some quick context, including on why we chose these 3 countries and why they matter. In part 2, we'll touch on general ICT and geopolitical trends in the 3 countries, explaining why and how this informs their respective cyber governance positions. Third, we look specifically at the positions of India, Indonesia, and South Africa in global cyber governance discussions at the UN OEWG, showing how they tend to hold the middle ground on various key issue areas. And fourth and finally, we'll close with some implications for the global cyber governance discussions based on our look at these 3 middle ground and middle power countries. The use of middle power in this paper is to describe the systemic impacts of emerging powers that takes into account the institutional and ideational power of developing economies in cyberspace governance debates, while the non-aligned movement is used to describe an alliance established by a group of newly independent states in Asia and Africa in 1955. And these were states that did not side with either major powers in the Cold War, and their core principle includes the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations and the non-intervention in the internal affair of countries. As we move on to the substance of our presentation, I want to quickly highlight what the South African delegates said at the UN OEWG back in February. I don't believe this room is entirely divided between just delegations that believe there is a need for an international treaty and those that do not. Some, like South Africa, do occupy a middle ground. And with that, we'll move on to the Global South and the ICT discussions. So between 2019 and 2020, 128 million internet users came online for the first time in India, while internet use in many African countries saw double-digit growth. With the world's next billion internet users coming online from Asia and Africa, the internet center of gravity is shifting from the global north and the west to the global south and the east. And as a consequence of this shift, it is increasingly crucial to consider the viewpoints of non-Western countries in conversations about ICTs. And our paper explores the positions of India, Indonesia, and South Africa, all 3 of which have been actively involved in the UN processes for developing rules of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And in doing so, our paper contributes to a growing body of literature on this topic that focuses on emerging economies, particularly those that have been considered as middle power countries. So each of these countries our paper looks at has recently seen significant ICT developments, and these trends are important to understanding each country's respective positions on cyberspace governance. In India, the focus has been on transforming India into a digitally empowered society and knowledge economy. And despite this, challenges remain as cybercrime is on the rise and cybersecurity awareness remains low. In Indonesia, recognizing the potential of the internet, over $2 billion will be allocated in the 2021 state budget for ICT development. But Indonesia has also been concerned about the abuse of the internet as a vector for hate speech and misinformation. And social media especially has been used to weaponize religious intolerance. In South Africa, recent pieces of legislation on the protection of personal information and against cybercrime are a step towards lowering the prevalence of cybercrime and data breaches, but low cybersecurity awareness and lack of affordable devices and data plans have limited the benefits of the internet from being realized. And these are just some quick simplifications of the developments, and more details can be found in our paper. But the common thread between all three of these countries is how they balance their relationships with US and China, as those two superpowers are critical partners for India, Indonesia, and South Africa. The desire to attract investment from both the US and China is likely to be part of the broader logic which entices our three countries' cases to hold the middle ground in the cyber norms debate. For example, in India's case, there are tensions with the US on data localization policy and digital taxes. And regarding China, there have been deadly border clashes followed by a ban of over 100 Chinese mobile apps. And these tensions are likely to influence India so as to play a balancing game, preventing it from overtly backing either side. Moreover, as members of the non-aligned movement, India, Indonesia, and South Africa have a preference for multilateralism and not taking sides, and this view influences their positions on key issue areas of the debate. Now, I'll pass it over to Josh for our findings.
Well, thanks, Justin, and good morning or afternoon or evening to everyone. Thanks for having us. Looking at the public submissions and speeches at the UN OEWG, we were able to analyze the Indian, Indonesian, and South African positions on key issues within the debate. These included the issues of binding versus non-binding commitments, sovereignty concerns, lack of consensus, including a perceived lack of understanding and capacity, and as well as additional concerns such as cybercrime and the so-called militarization of cyberspace. For example, regarding the notion of a legally binding treaty for cyberspace, which is usually pushed by Russia and China and opposed by the EU and the US and Canada and their usual buddies, India, Indonesia, and South Africa have all expressed support for legally binding instruments to regulate state behavior in cyberspace, while simultaneously remaining vocal and firm in their support for the consensus achieved in previous GGE meetings, such as on the applicability of international law and regarding voluntary non-binding norms. Further, India, Indonesia, and South Africa also all raise issues related to sovereignty and sometimes sovereign equality, but often in very vague terms. This vagueness is further exhibited by all three of our country cases in the context of these countries calling attention to various concepts such as cyber weapons, cyber attacks, cyber deterrence, cyber terrorism as being poorly defined, and they do so without offering their own interpretations. The implication here is that further time and study of these terms is needed, which aligns more perhaps with the Russia-China camp than the Western one. Other examples and other issues can be found in our paper, and if anyone knows me, I'd be happy to discuss this further, and we'd all be happy to take more questions in the Q&A. But next slide, please. So to wrap things up, as Justin said in his opening, much of the thinking behind our paper can be tied to the quotation from South Africa, saying that some states do occupy a middle ground, which South Africa stated at the February 2020 OEWG, which was, I think, back when it was still possible to be in a room full of humans. Although our short presentation today can't fully capture it, our paper has shown some of the underlying conditions from socio-political to geopolitical, which explain why India, Indonesia, and South Africa hold a middle ground position in global cyber governance discussions, playing a balancing act between the like-minded and, I dare say, authoritarian camps. But so what? Why is this interesting, significant, or worthy of a 10-minute spiel at the prestigious Hague Conference on Cyber Norms? Next slide, please. Well, we believe that there are two main takeaways from our findings. First, as the title of our paper implies, we feel that there is value to closely considering positions and local contexts of countries which are not traditionally studied, such as those in the global south. And we also feel that this has been widely ignored in mainstream scholarship, as, for example, Arindra Basu and others have brought up earlier in this conference. Second, our findings and our claim that the middle ground positions of India, Indonesia, and South Africa are based on other political and geopolitical exigencies and thereby are purposeful and here to stay is worthwhile in and of itself. Many of the voices in academia and among practitioners seem to imply or even outright claim that the global cyber governance debates are between two main visions, or camps as we've called them, yet our paper indicates that a position in the middle may in fact be sustainable in the longer term and may actually be necessary due to different national contexts. As seen as in this past Monday's vote at the UNGA to again pass parallel yet opposing US-Russian resolutions on cybersecurity, we're seeing still a lot of countries which vote to support both sides, hence staying in the middle or remaining non-aligned. But what does this mean? Can we go forward meaningfully like this? If anything, a middle ground position almost questions the viability of these governance processes if countries can just kind of vacillate and be on both sides. So moving forward, we hope to build upon these thoughts further. And as part of that aspiration, we hope to hear your comments and questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Josh and Justin and Irene, for this interesting presentation and many good points, many interesting points. I would like to encourage everyone, please do ask your questions, use the question part on the bottom right of your screen. And meanwhile, moving from the analysis related to these three countries with middle ground position, one of them South Africa, and you almost wrapped up your presentation with a quote from South Africa. We are moving to South Africa. We are moving to the presentation of Professor Elmarie Biermann, who is the founder and director of Cybersecurity Center in Africa, with her presentation about global cyber capacity building cyber capacity building in the global South as a critical platform for leveraging equity, with a study of South African case. Elmarie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think I want to start off by agreeing that yes, South Africa do tend to sit on the fence because of a lot of alliances and because of our history, and I want to unpack that and give a quick overview of our work on cyber capacity building, focusing specifically on what is happening in South Africa, more on the ground practical level. It's a study that we've been doing for the past couple of years, and with me is Noel van der Waag-Cowling from the University of Stellenbosch. So in providing that, we focused on let me just go to the next slide. Yeah, a cyber capacity building pillar, but mapping that to the more technical side of the cyber norms. And we tend to distinguish between the technical and the softer side. And so, but all cyber norms are not created equally. And within that, trying to work towards, but where we are currently at, identifying those challenges, but also providing frameworks for moving forward. Where President Ramaphosa emphasized that we need to move towards being a capable state, because in an underdeveloped and undercapacitated state, the cyber norms debate is a bit shadowed by many other pressing and resource-intensive challenges. And especially also that within such resource-challenged nations that we have this danger of that reality that some of these countries will be left behind. And I think that also links to that sort of middle ground that was established by the previous speakers. It's just because of that. And then also looking at what is the obvious challenges versus this global South versus the global North, and especially looking at something simple like, you know what, we're facing a really skills and IP migration and skills poaching from the global north, and how can we incorporate that into providing our solution framework. So if we unpack that from a technical perspective and look at a lack on a national cybersecurity strategy that's being implemented and how that effect filters down onto providing suitable cybersecurity posture levels, where we sit with a dysfunctional National Cyber Advisory Council. It was established in 2013. Focused members were mainly from the legal entities and not incorporating really specialists from the cybersecurity side. And that then led into a lack of national coordinated cyber response center, where our national CERT in terms of the cybersecurity hub is really dysfunctional. But what is the impact of something like that when you need something on a government level that need to advise and need to provide intel onto your organizations on the lower grounds? Is that your sectors started to develop their own sector-specific certs just to bypass that. So they provide or shadow their national capability. And we've seen that with the banking sector and Sabric and our mobile phone centers in terms of Mobric. Now, connected to that is just that in intel. If we talk about stats in terms of threat profiles, in terms of security postures, in terms of where South Africa are at on a technical space for cybersecurity, then that is actually skewed because our intel is actually driven by the vendors and they are dominating this market. So we are actually providing stats in silos, and it actually drives cyberspace in different directions. So cyber have been politicized. So we are able, in terms of our cyber norms, to provide that sort of respond in a political manner, but not in a technical manner. So we have no allocated cyber budget. Now compare that with your other nations. It leaves our national entities under threat and exposed. And being that, at the same level of defense is required because cyber is transnational and it's borderless. So that boils down back to our national cyber infrastructure management, because CETA, that is responsible for the governance thereof, are not set up to handle or manage the cyber properly. And then that's that underlying, and I think the previous speakers also referred to that, is that level of cyber security awareness on a national level. And that is from awareness up to specialized qualifications, where we sit with universities that are listed in the top 500 of the world, but they didn't come to play really in terms of defining specialization frameworks and defining learning paths and coming to play that part and take the hand of industry and really build skills within this environment. So now we sit with all of these nice things happening, but it's very much in silos. It's very much dislocated. You have your private sector on the one side that is actually doing all of this stuff to stay alive, because there's no real support from a government perspective, especially when it comes to intel and certs. So what do we do about that? That's where the difficulty comes in, but it's actually very basic, as we have to get the basics right first, because we need actually protection from ourselves, as we are fighting against ourselves here. We need structural reforms, but also alignment to get this battered and fragmented system right in terms of legislation. Yes, we now have finally the Protection of Personal Information Act that's coming into play in June next year. But we need more than that, the whole legislation and regulatory framework. We need the strategic framework, and then resourcing, and then moving from that to operations and implementations, looking specifically at integrated skills development program and not just flooding the market with international certifications that's not specific to the South African and the African environment. Looking at functional private and public partnerships, because this stage is everybody's for its own. you are protecting your own. There's no legislation or regulation that forces me to actually make way that the organization is in distress or there has been a breach. That's why we see on the dark web quite a number of South African organizations just ending up there with their data. Data-driven intelligence, and I think that one is really one that matters and that is not present. To collect, to collate, to analyze and present that on a national level. We actually no idea in terms of the threat vectors that is at play on a daily level. Public awareness program, and not just awareness program into the rural areas, public awareness program on a national level, because it is extremely low. Build regional partnerships to share expertise. Yes, South Africa is good at that. We can do this, responding politically. We have alliances all over the place, from the left to the right. And then cyber drain. Our contracts for training programs to put more people through the system is to develop capacity to not only being able to respond politically, but also technically, to something that fit our very well written constitution. So if we unpack that back to the norms, then yes, on the softer side, South Africa is there, and the capability is there, and the passion is there. But on a technical side, there is quite a number of actors in missing. So that was just a quick intro into that is what our paper is about. That is what our data reflects, and without making too many enemies on a national and an international level, then I will stick with that.
Thank you very much, Elmarie. Very interesting points from all of our speakers. So to all of you, now we took a look at various sides of inclusions, be it country positions or stakeholder groups or their national capacity building and capacity as a whole, ways to reach consensus. And we have quite a few excellent questions from the audience, and Fabio, you had a very excellent conceptual framework presented here, and we have quite a few conceptual questions for you. From Ximena, from Central European University. The first question, and I'm going to give you both of them. Her first question is, agonism was initially conceived as an alternative democratic theory to the liberal hegemonic thought. International society is not a democratic space, and there is a risk of escalation that cannot be contained. I understand that you see the position of Russia and China as anti-pluralistic, but an argument can be made that they are the greatest pluralist. I don't know if you're going to agree with this, of all, since they embrace the pluralist understanding of international society as understood in the English school. These two observations led Ximena to the question, do you use the liberal understanding of pluralism as your conceptual benchmark? If so, is it in line with the Marxist sensibility?
Okay, thank you, Tanya, and thank you, Ximena. Actually wrote 3 pages to reply to this question, but I will not read them all, otherwise Tanya will cut me off again. But so yeah, I mean, very interesting question. I think it's of course, and I would love to discuss with you all not only the different interpretation of Chantal Mouffe writing, but also the very evolution of her thought. And I think that's the key to answer your question. Her thought has been kind of evolving around different issues, and it creates, of course, the different debates and always the risk of falling in the liberal trap. That being said, yes, I agree that, of course, if we think about pluralism from an English school perspective, that would be would allow us to argue that China and Russia are pluralist in that sense. The idea here was primarily to focus on a pluralism not only of the states, of interstate relations, like the one of the English school, but more about thinking about the question of inclusion beyond the state. And in that sense, so the argument for governance was not one of an ontological one related about the status of international society, but more about a pragmatic one and the problems that are associated with consensus building when we go about creating spaces for democracy in these fora. So that was kind of the approach, more of a pragmatic one rather than one related to how I see international society when it comes to the analysis of the open-ended working group.
Thank you very much, Fabio. And the next question goes to Louise and André. Can the problem of multi-stakeholder legitimacy be addressed within the UN system, or does it even undercut legitimacy?
Do you want to answer, Louise? Or?
Yeah, I can comment on that. That's fine. So I think there's an echo. Someone with. Hello. Okay, I think now it went. No, there's still a huge echo. Sorry.
I think we're seeing the screen through someone that has a screen shared still. I think it was the last presenter.
Okay.
Okay. No, so that's fine. So what I was going to say, thanks so much, Dennis, for that question. I think the legitimacy, I mean, the thing is what kind of legitimacy we're talking over here and whose legitimacy are we actually talking about? I think our work really kind of, if we had to kind of engage with one part of your question, is really that one. Like, if we are talking about building spaces or institutional mechanisms for civil society to engage, or other actors, non-state actors, whose legitimacy is being favored over there. So it's really about questioning these kind of this stakeholderism perspective that we see in internet governance and we see in other spaces, right? Which is almost the stakeholderization of these different groups. So this is, I think, how we would read the question, but I would say that yes, I think there is a possibility for increasing inclusion and increasing the legitimacy and multi-stakeholder legitimacy as well through what they call, the changes in the institutional dialogue. I think there is a possibility over there, and I think states will have to really think about that. And I think another thing on the yes side is when you look at the BPF cybersecurity, for example, they have been trying to trace how other kind of multi-stakeholder initiatives kind of come back to these discussions at the first committee. So I think there's a double movement over there of thinking how these other stakeholders engage in these spaces. And obviously it is a state-driven space. And also like how these other initiatives kind of flow into and influence and strengthen the legitimacy and multi-stakeholder legitimacy, if we want to use that term, within the context of the OEWG. So I think that's that. André, do you want to comment on that?
No, I just wanted to say that I think both the cases of the accreditation with the ECOSOC and the choices that were made regarding the GGE process compared to other GGEs within the UN show that there are other ways of engaging with civil society within the UN system. And
sorry, just to follow up on that, I'll be short. Again, like if these mechanisms are institutionalizing a particular form of engagement over there, what kind of civil society is engaging over there? Because in the case of the ECOSOC accreditation, is only ECOSOC accredited organizations, and normally they are big organizations and organizations that have, a consistent engagement at the UN system. So an organization from, let's say, the Global South or other regions, what are the constraints that they face in engaging in these spaces? So what this multi-stakeholder legitimacy favors at the end of the day. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Louise. And apparently it comes down to the question of what civil society actually is, as defined by the United Nations or OEWG. And the next question goes to Gold, Justin, and Irene. And I will join two questions here. The first one is, what does middle ground mean exactly? Does it mean support in both sides, or does it mean position in between both both sides somewhat unique way? Are they merely selecting from different sides what they like, or do they set their own vision and go forward with this? And I will join it with another question, which is how these middle ground positions, which apparently they come to somehow, be used for consensus building. Where and how do these positions provide fertile ground for consensus, if they do? Thank you.
Thank you for the great question. So I'll try my best to tackle it. So obviously our paper has a very small N. We only covered 3 countries. So my answers today will be based on this very small number of cases. I think in terms of what does middle ground mean, it seems to me, and my co-panelist feel free to disagree after, but it seems to me that in their position, these 3 countries seem to, yes, support both sides, but while also acknowledging their domestic context or domestic challenges in providing the reasons why they think that, you know, yes, maybe there is value in binding treaty, but also, yes, there is value as well in supporting existing processes. And these are the reasons why. And when it comes to explaining why they are open to considering both positions, they then mention a whole host of domestic challenges that they face as a reason why they hold this position. In terms of where and how, so Dennis's question in terms of where and how middle ground positions can be used for consensus building, I think from the statements that we analyzed, these 3 countries all identify once again the challenges that they face domestically. And so I think by focusing on some of these shared challenges, they can be used to build consensus. So for instance, many of these countries mention challenges with regard to capacity building, the need for more funding in order to facilitate a norm cascade, right? So to facilitate a better acceptance and better understanding of what cyber norms actually entail, and also even, you know, what does a treaty actually mean, right? If that is what some countries prefer. So I think by better understanding, you know, the commonalities between countries that hold middle ground positions, yes, have identified as challenges, like I said, like capacity building and funding, that would help to move the process forward. And also I'll end just by saying that GGE and OEWG are not the only 2 fora that rely on consensus, right? There are other regional organizations like the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, for example, ASEAN, that also rely on consensus. So I think by doing these efforts, not just at the OEWG, but also at regional organizations level, by focusing on identifying common ground and how to move forward on the common ground, I think would be helpful for the process moving forward. I'll pass it over to Justin or Josh if they want to add. Thank you.
Sure, I could throw in a few points, and hi Dennis and Max, good to hear from both of you. Both have been mentors, and Dennis's great program at The Hague actually helped start off my career in looking at cyber norms when I was a visiting fellow there a year and a half ago. So I recommend it to people to check out. I would just maybe add to Irene's comment that maybe on the more negative or less productive side, having countries with middle ground positions vis-a-vis whether that can lead to more consensus. I mean, what we've almost seen, at least in my opinion, and looking at our paper, is that countries like India or Indonesia will support many different things, which can then lead also to support for duplication or like a US and a Russian resolution. We saw on Monday, this past Monday, Indonesia, for example, voted yes to both Russia's resolution to extend the OEWG for 5 years, and also voted yes to the US resolution, which said, let's wait until the current OEWG finishes and then decide. So it's like, I don't know how, I think this kind of needs to be further explored, and we might try to take our paper in that direction, but there's also a kind of redundancy that comes out of it, or a kind of counterproductiveness maybe, to just kind of floating in the middle and sort of supporting things on both sides, if you can classify them as sides. And to Max, on I think you asked whether these countries have their own unique view or unique position. I think we really have found that no, at least in the 3 countries that we looked at, they don't have kind of a third ground unique vision. They're kind of like, we like a bit of this, we like a bit of that, we support this a little, but also would like to consider this. And I think this is also aligned with what Arindrajit and his co-panelists on Tuesday found also with India, where they kind of said, like, yeah, they don't have a very strict or clear position. It's kind of confusing, I think is the word that Arindrajit used. So my answer to Max would be no on that. And to Dennis's question would be to highlight that it might lead to more redundancy.
Thank you, Josh. And Justin, do you have anything to add here?
No, I think they've done a great job of capturing everything we did in our paper.
Thank you very much. And then we will move to the question for Professor Elmarie from Onyendidi Olibamoya from the University of Bath. In unpacking the national challenges South Africa faces, it is apparent that these are common challenges faced by other African states like Nigeria. In your opinion, what do you suggest is mainly responsible for South Africa's visibility in the cyberspace despite its national realities?
Good question. The visibility side, I think that's a more deeper and layered answer that's required for that. Visibility needs to be part of any security strategy. With our move from physical systems up to our Internet of Things devices, and now and into the cloud, it changed that whole scene of how you can't just collate that and put a boundary around your network and suddenly you can protect that. So in terms of the visibility, I also we need to look at the economic instances where South Africa comes from. South Africa is still one of the states in Africa with one of the largest economies. I think Nigeria surpasses us just now. So, and in terms of our technology adoption and how did the technology adoption in terms of our general population, but also from a perspective of your industries and your organizations, is way different than the rest of your African countries. And I think that's a historical thing as well, that had an impact on that. But interestingly enough is that we have to look at moving forward is also in terms of this visibility, not just on a cybersecurity awareness level, increasing that, but also look at your countries such as Rwanda and Mauritius that really targeted this visibility aspect within the cybersecurity strategies, and see how do they address that. So difference between South Africa and Nigeria, I think it's mainly adoption, it's awareness, it's the approach in terms of that digitization of on both a national and an organizational level, if that answers your question.
Thank you very much. And one more question to Louise and André. To make the OEWG more inclusive and effective, do you think it is necessary to move away from consensus building, but more toward a body for studying and building knowledge base on advancing responsible state behavior?
Well, in our paper, what we do is we try to the main aim is for us to rethink the interaction between the state and civil society, and to sort of question the pre-assumptions that we bring to the table when we talk about multi-stakeholders, when we talk about opening up the process, or even to plurality, like Fabio was talking about just earlier. So I'm not sure there is a one way of addressing the issue. I think it's more in terms of the questions that we ask rather than necessarily the answers that we provide. And in that regard, I don't know if creating a more technical body would necessarily answer the question. And there I probably side with Fabio's approach, and I would say that would sort of depoliticize the process, which is something that I'm not entirely sure it's a great idea either. So, yeah, I would say that more important than the answers is what other questions are we asking. But I don't know if Louise wants to add something.
Yeah, I'd just like to add 2 points. I think, yeah, I also agree with André that it's not about like providing just the answer, but I would say that the OEWG right now, it really needs to decide what it wants to do in terms of inclusion and in terms of also going forward, and the relationship between the OEWG and the GGE, that is absolutely kind of evident. That's the discussion that we've been having, and also the POA is also another thing that comes into the whole kind of confusion around how these different proposals and these two tracks will go forward. So I think the OEWG really needs to decide one on how inclusion will be framed going forward. Obviously, I think it was very innovative in the sense of the intersessional. The thing is, with coronavirus, I think there was a huge impact in how other stakeholders could actually participate, or even like as an observer in the sessions. So I think going forward with everything going online, probably, or not, we never know. But that is an uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty at the structural kind of macro contextual level, but I think there's also uncertainty as to like whether Russia and other states will actually want to change the tone of the OEWG to become what you asked, Irene, which is a place where knowledge is being cultivated and kind of assembled so that it can support other agendas such as capacity building and confidence building to kind of complement the efforts that are kind of going forward in the GGE. So there's a lot of uncertainty over there, as I said, and I think we will probably have to like just continue to observe, but I think it really needs to decide, and I don't see that happening in the near future. So.
Thank you very much, Louise. And I wanted to ask our panelists if you have questions to each other, but before I do so, because I want to give you some time to think, because I saw that some of you made some notes, I want to ask a couple of questions that came to my mind when I was listening to your presentations and to your answers in the Q&A session. And the first question is to Irene and George and Justin. I don't know if you looked at these from this angle, but Irene, you mentioned such regional organizations like ASEAN, and I know that, for example, South Africa, and this is probably also a question to Elmarie, is active in African Union. So if we are talking and thinking about middle ground positions and capacity and empowerment of these stakeholders and how they drive the consensus, do they take middle ground position at ASEAN or in African Union, or are they more like drivers there? So is there any dynamics between global and regional level, the multitude of efforts, be it norm making or any efforts to agree to reach consensus on anything in cybersecurity?
I think that one goes to Irene to start off, or?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to. That's a really great question. To be honest, I haven't really been following closely what the positions of different ASEAN member states have been. I do know that ASEAN endorsed in principle the GGE norms, so there is at least support for norms there. And I think in terms of the different member states in ASEAN, it seems to me that Singapore is really the driver of norms there. However, given the different levels of development and cybersecurity maturity or readiness, or however you'd like to call it, among different countries in ASEAN, right? You have countries like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, which still have very low internet penetration rates compared to places like Indonesia, the Philippines, certainly Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand. I think if I was to hazard a guess, I would think that they would also hold middle ground position just because of how different the reality is, I think, for the different member states in ASEAN, particularly from a level of development or internet penetration as I've described. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Elmarie, if you know anything from the African Union perspective and South Africa position there as a driver in terms of opinions and positions, maybe you can share something. But I don't know if you looked at that point.
No, yeah, I think something to understand, and I think I mentioned that briefly, is the different alliances. If you look at South Africa, then they're present in the African Union, they're present in the European Union, so they are on both the GGE and the Open Indo Working Group. So they both want to align with the West and as well as your markets in Russia and China, for instance. So in terms of the African Union, and the focus on cybersecurity is not that high. The priority is not that high. The laws that they did adopt was the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, and we sort of stuck there because you have a number of the nation states not adopting that. So that it's not a priority there. I think it's maybe more driven from a SABRIC point of view, and your BRICS nations. But they also, and I think that was my sort of thinking along the sides of the middle ground. You know, how do you think that's going to be possible to sort of shift them from that middle ground, or provide them with something just to move to at making solid decisions and providing solid growth within this arena.
Thank you very much, Elmarie. And Louise and André, I'm actually looking at you just to continue this conversation before I open the floor for your questions to one another. From your perspective, civil society, the role civil society plays at the OEWG is still questionable for me because of the issue of letting stakeholder in and letting stakeholder speak not being equal to multi-stakeholderism, and it's certainly not being equal to their opinions to be taken into account, to actually influence the positions, although I know a couple of views that might be different. I wanted to ask you from the regional perspective, is the role of civil society in any regional norm making or capacity, cybersecurity capacity building avenues, is it broader? Like, for example, Organization of American States, or even on the national level? Louise, I know that you're dealing with this in Brazil. So briefly, can civil society build its own capacity to participate from national and regional levels, or is it just too far and too high level when we're talking about OEWG?
Yeah, I think this question it kind of covers different levels, but just going to the question of the regional, I think what we want to question over here is exactly these solidified, which we see a lot, but like these solidified assumptions that cybersecurity is not, and cyber norms is not a place where civil society can make and shape norms. Obviously, there's a different kind of topography to how this engagement happens, be it, at a first committee process, which obviously, it doesn't mean that you're going to sit at the table in the same way as states are going to sit. But if you're committing or just saying that there is a possibility of turning this process, and I quote, the UNGA resolution of 2018 to make it more transparent, democratic, and inclusive, and then you say you're going to possibly open up, you're going to open up the possibility of having other stakeholders such as civil society in the table, then how you're going to make these two ends meet. And I think that's the key question over here for the international level. It's not about, saying that everyone's standing in the same, in the same level, because I don't think that's the question. But I think the question is, like, if you're committing or if you're giving that possibility, are you actually achieving that? And also at the regional level, definitely at the OAS, there were GGE kind of side meetings kind of in preparation for the OEWG and the GGA to start, and civil society and academia organized kind of workshops So this is a moment where civil society and other non-state actors come in to kind of inform, sometimes even kind of provide capacity building to diplomats that are negotiating. So the tracing of this influence and this legitimacy is much more fluid if we go through these kinds of micro practices that happen outside of the room where things happen or are decided at the international level. And at the national level, I think it's still very challenging, you know, to think about how civil society can engage in cybersecurity, and even like from the national level, think about international cyber norms discussion. But there are many cases where civil society can actually come to the table and participate. In Brazil, it's been a struggle, but it's kind of like gradual steps. In this case, like the recent Brazilian national cybersecurity strategy that was passed in the beginning of this year, which seems like ages ago, it actually, for the first time, it was the first document related to cybersecurity that actually went for open consultations for the general kind of public. So that is one step, you know. So I think it's about like tracing these steps and seeing if there's a consistency in the discourse and in the practice.
Thank you very much, Louise. And now I'm going to ask you all, if you have questions to each other, can you please raise your hand like this? So I will just call upon you. So André and then Fabio.
Yeah, thank you. I quite enjoyed the other presentations as well, just to say. I have a specific question about the point Joshua made when he said that some countries vote in the recent vote within the General Assembly, countries voted for both resolutions, and that was almost nonsensical in the sense that they were voting for a different thing, for things that mean the opposite. And the question I have, speaking from talking to people to diplomats that are at the UN and at the national base, but then are in contact with people at the UN, whether a lot of these countries, a lot of this has to do simply with the fact that they don't have enough people, and to the fact that you have one person that in the morning is on the session about ICTs, and then the afternoon is talking about health, and then in the evening about counterterrorism, and they deal with these issues as they come, literally. And therefore, there is a tremendous lack of capacity building, a tremendous lack of capacity that will probably address through capacity building. But the question, and this is the question I ask, is to what extent isn't there an actual interest from some of the big players in keeping things as they are, in keeping the knowledge relative?
Great question. You mean by big players, I presume you mean like Russia or China or US, and keeping the knowledge relative so countries maybe don't move sides. I mean, I think back always to this. Well, I thought this really great paper that Dennis showed me that Ximena Kurovska wrote on like shaping the narrative and narrative contestation or something like that, where kind of what I got out of it was that like the West should try to push our narrative and explain to other countries who have middle ground positions why it makes sense to vote like this, and kind of from building capacity, but also to kind of win with the narrative there. And maybe countries like China and Russia want to avoid that, or are happy with countries maybe being a bit confused or busy, as Arindra in his presentation talked about in the case of India, and maybe just frankly calling national office and some guy who's the head of whatever department isn't a cyber expert and kind of says, we'll just stick to both, or we'll support both, or we'll abstain. I think India, if I check my records, India abstained from the Russian resolution on Monday, but voted yes for the US one. And I mean, maybe they just didn't want to come across as taking a strong position, so they just throw out the abstain card. I don't know if I can properly answer your question. It's more the kind of thing that's a thing to keep in mind and think, but maybe Irene or Justin want to jump in with a sharp point.
Well, since Justin, Josh, and I are based in Canada, I thought I'd plug the Canadian government. I think the Canadian government and I believe together with the Netherlands as well, with the Dutch government, they've been funding a fellowship called Women in Cyber, in which they encourage, women, typically they're junior officials with the respective Department of Foreign Affairs, who are representing their countries at the UN in some of these discussions. So the purpose of the fellowship is to give them capacity building and training, and so that they would be better equipped to attend these cyber discussions. So I think, yeah, I don't know, maybe I'm trying to be a little bit more hopeful as opposed to being more cynical, but I do see these efforts happening in order to level the playing field, right? Of course, it's not perfect. There's more that needs to be done, but I think it's really encouraging to see a better gender balance at the last OEWG meeting, I believe, and to see these junior level officials come up to attend these trainings to have a better grasp on these really important cyber issues, while still, as André said, in the afternoon, perhaps they still have to attend meetings on health and other issues. But I think the fact that these trainings exist is very encouraging. And Tatiana, Justin has a question for Elmarie later when you have a moment. Thank you.
Yes, we have quite a few minutes left. So, Josh, I think that Louise, Marie, and André can get in contact with you to answer your question. I guess Fabio, is your question short? So you can go next and ask yours, and then we will move to Justin, I think. And Fabio, you're muted.
It was very interesting to see how these different kind of overlapping between the different presentation, and I think there is a bigger fly in the ointment of all of this, and that's the consensus building. So I was wondering for the other panelists, can we think about middle ground positions as tactical ones, more of a wait and see kind of positions, rather than more strategic ones?
So who is going to go over this first? Justin, yeah.
I mean, I can quickly throw in a few garbled words, but I think one thing in our paper, one of the main arguments is that there is a strategic, I think you just said, Fabio, a middle ground as being a strategic position or purposeful. That is almost one of the hypotheses we had in our paper in terms of staying on the good sides of China and the US, but while also kind of flirting with each other, but then also playing hard to get, meaning that they can kind of leverage that if they want something from the US, they can say, oh, well, then maybe we'll vote for a binding treaty. And then if they want to deter the US from doing something, then they can kind of use that as leverage. So maybe there is a purposeful, it would be cool to have a diplomat on the panel, or if someone was listening, to see what they thought of the kind of politicking behind that. But I think it's kind of a safe space to be in that also works out strategically, maybe not so strategic in the sense that in the longer run, these countries might be missing out in shaping the global cyber norms discussion or the global rules of the road in a way that would be in their country's interest. But maybe they haven't figured out fully what their country's interests are. I know India is undergoing a big kind of foreign policy rethink. At least I'm under the impression that it is. And so it probably has pros and cons. Maybe the pros are more shorter term and strategic, and maybe in the long run it's not, or maybe in the long run it is strategic to just stay in the middle, not get on anyone's bad side, and kind of see where the river flows, and then kind of make up a mind.
I'll just add something briefly. So, and actually, I think this question connects nicely to what André asked before. The fact that these diplomats attend various meetings, various votes on different resolutions. So in the morning, they might attend a meeting at the OEWG, but in the afternoon, they might attend a meeting on health. And, in a health resolution, a country like India or Indonesia might need help from China, to get a vote passed or something like that, right? So I think an interesting research agenda going forward is looking at vote buying. I mean, I don't know if it's a buying per se, or vote swapping, okay, I'll vote yes on your resolution on this topic if you vote, no in my resolution on the other topic, right? So I do think that there is something, I think that it would be really interesting to see if, the votes that these countries cast at the OEWG is related to or in competition with other resolutions that these countries are involved in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I know that we are actually, it's now 3:30 here, and we are at the end of the session, but as I'm a moderator and I have a superpower, I'm going to use my superpower to extend the session for 3 minutes, and I will I think it was Justin who had a question for Elmarie, so Justin, go ahead.
Yeah, it's just a very quick question, because both of our paper looks at South Africa. So I just kind of wanted to know from your research, is the middle ground position something unique to South Africa and the African continent, or have you seen other African countries kind of take a stance, or have they all been kind of hedging between both camps and taking the middle ground position as well?
Yeah, I can't really speak for the other countries. But I think it is, and I think one of the reasons is that you guys just mentioned that now is in terms of that knowledge space, really understanding that space. So the moment that you send delegates to that various forums, is that you end up, I want to say, sending the next schmuck in line, but I won't do that. Sending the next guy in line that don't have any grasp of this cyberspace, and now has to sit and you know what, follow and vote, and that's why they don't vote. So that's to me, that's a huge concern, because it's not necessarily the viewpoint of the country, but it is just because you sit there with a person that is not necessarily have the right expertise to sit in that. And so it boils down to building that competencies from a national level on the home ground. So no, I think I'm not going to let myself out on what I think the other countries do, but I would say yes, I think that's the same.
Thank you so very much, and we are exactly at the end of these 3 minutes right now, and thank you so much to all of you for this very interesting discussion. I hope that our attendees who are here are enjoying it. I hope that you all can give a silent and also silent applause to our panelists, and I would also like to thank not only you but also my co-moderator, who is sitting across the room from me, Monica, who also made this session happen. Thank you very much all, and please stay with us because we do have a keynote at 4 p.m. And of course, after this keynote, we will also have the wrap up of this conference. And yes, I mean, stay with us, rather come back, because we are going to have a break. Thank you.